This week we have kind of a review. If you remember from the last couple of themed months, in the last week I try to show you all some clips that kind of relate back to a lot of the things that we've been talking about earlier in the month, as kind of a way to just relax and review the month without having to do a ton of written work or drawing work. You are, of course, always welcome to draw and things in the background while we have the clips going on. First off, just so that I don't forget, a reminder about the donation page. We are able to keep the classes free because of your donations. So if you haven't checked that out, please do check it out. And if you have checked it out, feel free to check it out again. We will definitely let you donate more than once if you wish. So this month we have been talking about great women in comedy, and we've covered some storytelling with Ellen DeGeneres. We've covered character work with Whoopi Goldberg, and we talked about working with visual gags, with props and with costumes and with set pieces with Carol Burnett last week. Those have been our big female comedians. Of course, we've touched on some others along the way, but those have been kind of the big ladies that have been the theme for each week. And this week we have another woman who is kind of the theme for this week. And I don't think that many people would disagree with me that she is probably the most famous and most influential woman in comedy, at least in the 20th century, if not of all time. There are so many women in comedy, and even everyone in comedy who take great inspiration from her. And comedy is, and the way that television works is largely based on her work. And this person is Lucille Ball. I'll share a picture of her here. This is Lucille Ball. How many of you have heard of Lucille Ball before? You probably should have heard of Lucille Ball because I have shown clips of hers in our class before. But her most famous show was a show called I Love Lucy, and she had several other shows after that. She was on television for most of the second half of the 20th century. She pretty much always had a show on. But her most famous show was a show called I Love Lucy, and it was really the show that kind of made television what it was. In the year 1947, there were about 40,000 televisions in the United States, and I Love Lucy premiered in the year 1951, and by 1952 there were 1.2 million television sets in the United States. So it went from 40,000 to 1 million because I Love Lucy kind of changed the revolution in television. Have you ever listened to a television show and there was a laugh track underneath where you can hear the audience laughing in the background? I Love Lucy invented that. I Love Lucy said, well, if we're having a comedy show, we might as well film it with an audience so that you can hear the laughter. And so they brought in a studio audience, and there were live people laughing at the show. Now, there were shows in the past that had what they called canned laughter, which is where they would take recordings of people laughing and they would just make it sound like people were laughing at the jokes. But this was the first time they had an actual live audience. This was the first time that they used film to record the show. They used to film, or they used to tape all of the shows live, and they would be a live broadcast and it just wouldn't be around. So because they were able to film I Love Lucy, we were able to have something known as the rerun. So all of these shows that you're able to see from, previous to now, not live, that you can stream on Netflix, or you can stream on Hulu or any of these different platforms, or watch reruns on television. I Love Lucy invented the rerun by filming the episodes on television. And there's also another television technique called the 3-camera technique, where you use 3 cameras and film a scene 3 different ways at the same time, and then you can cut back and forth, and it makes editing a lot easier. And that 3-camera technique was also the advent of I Love Lucy. So all of these things that were Lucy and her husband, Desi Arnaz, they were their idea. They invented these things for television, and they're things that are still used in television today. Lucy was the first female star of a television show in this way. She was the first woman to carry a show. She was so successful that not only did she start her own production company, she bought a studio, and she became the first female studio head. There was an old movie studio that she used to work for as a contract player called RKO Studios. And she and her husband, Desi Arnaz, bought that studio and called it Desilu Studios. Desi Arnaz and Lucille Ball, Desilu Studios. And that studio was one of the biggest television studios for the next 50 years. If you've ever seen Star Trek, that show was filmed at Desilu Studios. The Dick Van Dyke Show, Gilligan's Island, any of those shows from the 50s, 60s, and 70s were all shot at Desilu Studios. So when I say that it really doesn't get bigger and more influential in terms of women in comedy than Lucille Ball, this is what I'm talking about. This was a big, major influential figure in the world of comedy. And not only was she influential in all of those ways outside of the comedy, she was also really funny. And her show was really funny and still has people laughing at it 60, 70 years after the fact that it was made. There is, if you go to Universal Studios, either in Orlando or in Hollywood, there's a museum that is called Lucy a Tribute. It has a lot of like set pieces and costumes and props from the show. So there's a whole museum in these 2 places. And a few years ago, they started a national comedy museum. It's the biggest museum dedicated to comedy in the country, the National Comedy Museum, and they decided to put it in Lucille Ball's hometown of Jamestown, New York, because that's how big of a deal she was. So if you haven't had a chance to check out I Love Lucy, you can check out I Love Lucy on many platforms. They have it on Hulu, they have it on Amazon, they have it on Paramount Plus. So check out some I Love Lucy if you get a chance. But for today, because as I said, we're using this last class as kind of a review, we'll use some I Love Lucy to review some of the things that we talked about. So the first week we talked about storytelling and the use of storytelling in comedy, and how you have a premise, the comic premise, you have your beginning, middle, and end. You can decide on genre, whether it's a fish out of water story or a clash of context story. But you start out with your comic premise, and we looked at Ellen DeGeneres and her phone call, her one-sided phone call, that style of story. But for Lucy, I wanted to share this clip, which is the comic premise here is that Lucy is trying to film a television commercial for this product called Vitameatavegamin. And what happens is that what they don't tell her is that the product has high alcohol content. So it's supposed to be this vitamin supplement, but it also has a high alcohol content. So that is the comic premise, the comic starting point for the story. And so I'm going to share this clip with you, and you can see what happens with that comic premise. So that's our little example of how you can take a comic premise of what if this person has to film a commercial, but what they don't know is that the bottle has high alcohol content. Simple little idea. That's how you start your comic story with your comic premise. Here's the thing that should happen the way that should happen in a certain way, and then something goes wrong. Something happens that makes it go wrong. We looked at a lot of those in our stories that we created earlier, where start out with the idea, oh, I'm on my way to school, or I'm going to the grocery store, or picking up dinner somewhere, and those things, you have an expectation of how they're supposed to go, and then to create a comic premise, you just take it in a different direction. Then the next week, we started talking about characters, and we looked at Whoopi Goldberg, and we talked about how Whoopi Goldberg developed her solo show from characters that she grew up knowing in New York. She would write about, these older women that she would see, little kids that she would see, but basically just like took stories from her life and took people from her life and fleshed out characters. And there's two ways to deal with characters. One is we talked about before, which is stock characters, which is where you have a character that just kind of represents an idea. So, for example, it might be, a mean, shushy librarian that represents the idea of a person, right? That kind of person that you would see in the world, and that's called a stock character. Whereas you also have this style of creating characters, this Whoopi Goldberg style, where you take very specific characters, and we talked about George Lucas has the quote. The more specific you are, the more universal you become. So the more specific you can make a character, the more people are able to identify with that character. And so you have two ways of approaching the characters. You can use stock characters, or you can use real specific characters that you derive from observation. This character that I'm going to show you next from I Love Lucy is a little bit of a blend of both. I talked about how influential Lucy was for women, but Lucy was also very influential in terms of race and race relations as well, because Lucille Ball was married to a man named Desi Arnaz, who was from Cuba. And when she got offered to do the show I Love Lucy, she said, well, I want my actual husband to play my husband. And the networks said, no. We can't have an interracial couple on television. Remember, this was the early 1950s when this show was getting developed. So people were a lot more close-minded back then. And they said, no, there's no way. No one would want to see an interracial couple on television. And Lucy said, no, I'm not doing this show unless I can have Desi play my actual husband. And they said, no. Not only do people not want to see it, they wouldn't even believe it. They wouldn't even buy you as a real couple. And she was like, but we are a real couple. And so what Lucy and Desi did was they wrote a stage show together. And they took that show on tour, and it was a huge success. And so they could come back to CBS and say, hey, look, guess what? America does buy us as a couple. America will come and see us perform together as a couple. So your argument holds no water. And so Lucy and Desi became the first interracial couple portrayed on television as well. And so this character that, or this scene that I'm about to show you is a scene that was actually written for their live show that they took touring around to get people on board with them as a couple. And then when they were actually doing I Love Lucy, they wrote this routine into one of the episodes because it had been a really popular part of the show. So Lucy is playing a character here. It's drawn from, it's kind of a broad, stocky, silly kind of clowny character, but it comes from this real place from their lives as well. So it's kind of in the middle of the two approaches to characters that we were talking about. So here's the second little clip. All right. Just a little side note there. When I was in 5th grade, my friend and I did that routine for a talent show, and we came in 2nd place. That was one of the first comedy things that I ever did, was in 5th grade. I played the Lucy part, and my friend played the Ricky part in our school's talent show, and we won 2nd place. I thought that was pretty cool. But yeah, so that's a really fun routine that deals with characters. So last week we didn't get to everything that I'd hoped to cover last week, but we did get to a lot of it, and you guys came up with some really fun stuff. We talked about props, and we talked about Wile E. Coyote. You came up with props that Wile E. Coyote could use, and the ways that in fact we talked about ways that they could break on him. But our main female comic was Carol Burnett, and we talked about costumes and how much great potential there is in the visual gags of a costume, as well as props and set pieces. And in I Love Lucy, there are tons and tons of examples of Lucy having trouble with various props. I've showed the clip in here before of the candy on the conveyor belt, and she and Ethel are having to pick up the candy and put it in their hand and put it in their mouth and all of that stuff. So there's examples of props. I've shown the clip in here before of her trying to take a ballet class, and she gets trapped up on the ballet bar. So she definitely can get comedic mileage out of playing with props. In terms of costume, there's an episode where she gets a trophy stuck on her head and spends most of the episode inside of a trophy and trying to like get out of this thing. There's an episode where she plays a showgirl, and she's trying to get a job in Ricky's show as a showgirl, and she has this giant headdress that is too heavy for her, and so she's trying to like do all these dances and these moves and everything, and she can't because this heavy headdress is just weighing her down. So she can get mileage out of props. She can get mileage out of costumes and visual gags out of that. But one of the things that we didn't get to cover last week is a set piece and getting a comedic gag out of a set piece. And so for that, I thought one of the probably one of, if not the, definitely in the top 3 most famous episodes of I Love Lucy. And to provide a little bit of context, so Lucy is on vacation in Italy, and back in the day, when they would make wine, the way that you would squish the grapes would be to actually get into a big vat of grapes and stomp the grapes with your feet. And so they would have people go into these vats of grapes and stomp the grapes so they could get the juice to turn it into wine. Now they have machines to do that, obviously. But back in the day, that's the old-fashioned way of doing it. And so Lucy, who's on vacation in Italy, wants to get that experience. So she goes to a vineyard and wants to stomp grapes. And so this is what happens. So the interesting thing about that bit, it's like I said, it's one of probably the most famous scenes of I Love Lucy, and it had actually happened by accident. So that woman that they hired to be this Italian grape stomper was actually Italian and spoke mostly Italian and spoke very little English. And so she actually didn't know that she really didn't understand what was going to be happening in that scene. And so when Lucy went to kick her in the behind, this other lady actually got angry. And so that fight that ensued with them throwing the grapes at each other and rolling around, it actually happened because that lady was actually mad, and Lucy just kept going with it, and just said, okay, if this lady's mad, let's just keep filming and see what happens. And there was actually a moment in there where that lady held Lucy's head under the grape juice for almost a full minute, and Lucy thought she was going to be choked under the grapes. But that scene happened totally by accident, and it turned out to be one of those famous scenes. So that it not only shows us here you can get comedic mileage out of a set piece. It also takes us back to our improv comedy principle of yes and. When something happens, when someone makes an offer, you say yes and you just go with it, and you keep the scene moving. Imagine if they had stopped down and called cut and said and explained to this lady, oh no, don't get mad, we're doing this. So that one scene gives us the set piece, it gives us the improv yes and like we've talked before about our different clown archetypes, where we have the red clown and the white clown, the Joey and Auguste that we've talked about before. In this scene as well, you can see there's one of the clowns that's kind of the boss and is bossing the other one around, and the other one just kind of is like goofily oblivious. And you have the boss clown with the Italian grape stomper who's no nonsense, she wants to get this done, and then you just have the goofy doofus red clown that is kind of messing things up for everybody. So I love using I Love Lucy in the same way that I often show a lot of clips from Wile E. Coyote cartoons, because all of this stuff that we talk about with comedy principles, you can find in pretty much any Wile E. Coyote cartoon. Same thing is true of Lucy. You can find pretty much all of these comedy concepts and elements of comedy that we talk about and that we work on in this class. You can find them in episodes of I Love Lucy. So that's pretty much our review. Does anyone have anything that they're working on that they want to share? I see some tops of heads. I usually presume that to be drawings of some kind. So if you have any drawings you want to share, you can share that. But
so I have a question for you, Mike.
Yes.
When because I think this is very apropos to what we're doing in this whole comic writing our own comic stuff. When they were going through their bits, right? And I know you were kind of going over comic writing. They were just kind of doing some loose writing and then they would fill in? So you mentioned like what happened with this bit with Lucy and the grapes, and they kind of allowed for things to happen as they were writing, kind of like in a comic page where you might have the overall theme of what's going on that page, and then you're kind of allowing moments. You're finding a moment in there that maybe you weren't expecting.
Yeah, in fact, a lot of especially those kinds of comic performers that we would consider more on the clown side of things, like Lucy and Laurel and Hardy and Chaplin and the Marx Brothers and stuff like that. They definitely would have a loose idea, and the Marx Brothers would kind of do what Lucy and Desi did with their show. Is if you look at the Marx Brothers movies like Duck Soup or Monkey Business or Animal Crackers or any of those kinds of things, they would take those shows out on the road as stage shows and tour them around the country and figure out what worked and didn't work. And then once they had whittled down to what audiences responded to the best, they would film it. So they would have these these highly refined scripts that they were able to play around with on the road before they made it into the movie. And there's a great documentary on Charlie Chaplin called The Unknown Chaplin, where they take all of the film that he made that didn't become the film, and you can see him working out a gag, and he would, because he was directing the movies as he was performing in them, so he would record himself and then go back and watch it and go, no, I want this to be a little quicker. I want this to fall in a different way, or I want this to happen in a different way. And so he would film it and then look at it. And so you can take those films and you can watch him work it down and work it down and work it down and work it down, to where it gets to be the final gag that you end up with. So yeah, very, very often you have these performers working with a loose idea and then refining it and refining it and refining it. And most of what they use to refine is what gets laughs.
Well, I think it's important to understand that we can rewrite, and it's okay to rewrite.
Absolutely, yeah. In comedy, very rarely do you come out of the gate with exactly the way it's going to be by the end. There's a stand-up comedians, sketch comedy writers, even something like Saturday Night Live. They spend a whole week refining all of those sketches before they make it to air. And some of them, they might make it to rehearsal on Saturday afternoon, but it doesn't get enough laughs in rehearsal, so it gets cut, and maybe they'll come back to it later on, but it needs a little more work. So yeah, that refining process, that iterative process is a big part of comedy for sure, and in storytelling in general.
So would you say, because I would agree, like the chocolate one is one of my all-time favorite scenes from I Love Lucy, and then just stuffing their mouths with chocolates. Would you say that she's probably the most complete as far as when it comes to a creative, in this sense, where you can concept it, you can write it, you can film it, you can think of the props and the scenes that go with it? Would you say she's probably one of the most complete?
Definitely. She had a team of writers that she worked with, and so the main writers were this woman named Madeline Pugh and a guy named Bob Carroll Jr. And then those two, along with the director of the show, a guy named Jess Oppenheimer, the four of them would come up with these ideas, and then Lucy would work them out and try them out and say, this doesn't feel right, let's try it like this. And so it was very much a collaborative process with all of them. And they all worked together and were pitching ideas, and it's kind of an egoless collaboration that tends to work the best. There's a lot of different groups of comedy writers that work in this way, where it's whatever's the funniest idea in the room is what you go with, where you don't get latched onto, well, I want to do it my way. No, I want to do it my way. It's whatever gets the most laughs, whatever's the funniest idea in the room, that's what we go with. And it's not driven by what you want to do or what your thoughts on things are. It's just whatever's the funniest, that's what we do. And I like that kind of collaboration where everybody's just kind of on the same page of let's serve the story and let's serve the comedy, as opposed to trying to serve your own ego.
Totally agree with that. I found it fascinating. I love Lucille Ball. I didn't know, once I got more into some of the history of who she was, I just knew her as somebody on the TV. I didn't realize how in depth, especially on the business side of things, she was.
Yeah.
Which I found totally fascinating, because you and I were on the business side as well as the creative side.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that Chuck Jones and those Termite Terrace gag writers, they had that same kind of collaborative.
Yeah.
collaborative effort. You know, they were all pitching gags. They were all working on everybody's stories. In fact, I've seen clips of Chuck Jones talking about that, where he says, you know, this one might say directed by Chuck Jones, this one might say directed by Friz Freleng, but everybody was working on everybody's stuff together.
You know what's funny is I finally watched Extremes and In-Betweens. I love that. I bought an old library copy and watched that DVD. I thought it was hilarious. And so, you know, it was too, was I think an important thing that you kind of brought up even with Chuck, and how they would write and create these things, is that idea that it was funny to them. They weren't writing for kids, they were writing for themselves. So like when we were writing our stuff and trying to come up with things, is it funny to us? Is it cool to us? Is it something that grabs us or not? Or are we just trying to fit into a mold that we think is going to work?
Yeah, exactly. And that's one of the things I always talk about when I teach these classes in comedy, is that what I'm giving you is tools that you can use when you're trying to develop stuff. None of this is hard and fast. None of this is rules. They're little tools that you can see that they work from, you know, the examples that I show, but you can follow all of the rules exactly and still come up with something that is so tedious and boring and not funny at all. And so it's not, when I give all of this examples of things like, you know, saying yes and we talk about sets and costume pieces and first story, second story, red clown, white clown, stock characters, defined character, all of this different stuff. These are all different approaches, and they're all different little techniques you can use to help you along the way when you're writing something. But they are by no means, this is the set of rules, and these are the rules you have to follow in order to make comedy. Because as you say, ultimately it comes down to what makes you laugh. And if you're trying to put yourself into someone else's shoes and go, oh, what's going to make little kids laugh, or what's going to make old people laugh, or what's going to make this audience laugh, whatever audience you want to name, if you're trying to get inside their head and decide what they're going to think is funny, chances are it's not going to work. If you're creating stuff that makes you laugh and that makes you have fun, then people are going to latch on to that feeling. They'll feel you in that. They'll feel your sense of humor in that, and that's usually the comedy that works the best, is if it's something that's true to what makes you laugh.
Good tip.
I see Kat raised her hand.
Yes.
Well, I wanted to share a dragon I drew yesterday.
Oh, very cool. That's very cool. Is that for something, or are you just noodling around?
Well, I'm going to use it for my comic, which I'm really behind on and need to work on. And yeah.
That's great. Very cool. And Nathaniel, I see Nathaniel's hand raised. You have something you want to share?
Yes. So I'd like to share a drawing I did on a digital tablet. This is just printed.
Oh, very cool. What is this character that we're looking at?
This is Tater's character, Beetle Cake. Why does he have cake at the end of his name? I don't know. Maybe he's edible.
So that's a character that Tater has drawn before?
Yes.
Oh, very cool. How is everybody coming along on your comics? I heard that we have some that have been turned in already.
Yes, which is awesome. I'd love to see how everybody's is. Thank you for throwing that link in there, Scott. I have to ink my page still.
So is everyone working on something that's a part of one comic book story together, or is everyone kind of making their own little one-page story and it's kind of like an anthology?
Like their own one-page thing, anthology style.
Very cool.
And some people have like multiple pages, which astounds me because I do not have multiple pages.
I probably finished mine. Mine is the most one that is finished.
Did you turn yours in already? I'll take that as a no. So, Mike, in your comedy that you put on, you know, like as far as when you're creating, what's your favorite part of it? Do you have a favorite part that you really get excited about? Not that everything else is boring or anything like that, but just a part that, you know, everyone's kind of got like this thing of like, man, when I really get to this point, you know, I love this.
My favorite thing is when the performer or the performers and the audience are all having fun together in a way that is indescribable to someone that wasn't there. The biggest compliment you can give me after a show is to say, I saw your show and I was telling my friends about it and they didn't get it. And I was like, oh, you just had to be there. And that like, you just had to be there thing, that element is my favorite part of it is it's just this indescribable thing where the audience and the performers are having such a great time together and nobody can really explain why.
Yes, I would agree. But you feel like you're a part of the whole thing the entire time.
Yeah.
I dig it, man. Well, I love your stuff. I love what you do. I think it's key to creating, period. And I think the more people think of themselves as a creative, allows them to explore. Really, you're at kind of the beginning of all of that. It's all about that whole thought process and what it goes down and then experimenting with stuff. So yours is pretty key to the completion of everything else.
Well, thanks. Yeah, I think especially for a group that uses Chuck Jones and Chuck Jones philosophy as a kind of model for creativity, I think that combining the visual art, combining the animation, combining the comedy all together, they all walk so hand in hand, and I think Chuck's philosophy as a model or as a guide, as a guiding philosophy, it is the perfect way to synthesize those things because his work synthesizes all of them so perfectly. Agreed.
Well, hey man, I wanted to jump in on your Carol Burnett one because I wanted the props and sets and stuff. I think it's a fascinating, like, to even think of things in 3D before you even get into drawing. So I'm gonna go back and watch that once I post it to the site. I gotta bail for a board meeting, which is gonna be very boring. So I'll probably be working on my comic while the board meeting is going on. But I just wanted to say, Mike, thank you so much. You have been here for a year doing this. You, me, Lee, have been at the year mark, and this whole program and everything we would be far depleted if you weren't a part of this whole process. So thank you so much for lending your talents and your knowledge and everything to this, because I think it's extremely important. You're just an awesome guy.
Well, thank you, and I appreciate that. And the whole reason that I've been here for a year is because when the pandemic started, I was looking for people who were teaching online to get some ideas for how I could transfer my classes to an online format. And I came in and I did some drawing classes of yours, and that's when I reached out to Robert and Craig and said, I want to be a part of you guys. I want to work with you all. So I did. I can't even remember the classes that I took. I remembered making a carrot look different kind of textures in one of the classes that I did.
Slimy carrots, yes.
Yeah.
That was, I still have that. I had it on a big Post-it note page, and it's still, I posted it to the door on the other side of my studio. I still have it. Well, cool, man. Well, hey, I will of course be seeing you tomorrow, but I look forward to what you got coming up in Animation Month, and then what everybody else finishes out. So have a great night, man. I'll let you close it out. I'm gonna bail here at the site, but thank you very much, Mike. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you. All right, everybody. So you may have heard this from the other teachers, but next week we have a little bit of a spring break. We're taking the next week off, but then the month of April is animation month, and so everything is going to be geared towards animation, which is a brand new thing that we haven't done yet. So that's going to be really exciting. We have a fantastic new teacher named Boogie Black that's going to be teaching you guys some animation stuff. Naylene is going to be teaching some stuff. Daryl, who's been in here before, is going to be teaching some stuff. So that's going to be really exciting. In the month of April, we're not going to have officially any elements of comedy classes. It's not going to, there's not going to be a separate elements of comedy class because Boogie will be taking the Thursday slot, but I will be here and I will basically be a human clown model for you guys to work off of. So I'm going to be kind of demonstrating as a character or as like sometimes I'll be, well, anyway, we have a lot of surprises for you, but I will be demonstrating a lot of the concepts that he's talking about as a clown performer for you to draw. So so that's going to be really fun and interesting. I'll be so I say that to say there won't be elements of comedy in April, but I'll still be here in April working with Boogie on Thursdays, and it's going to be a lot of fun. So I hope you enjoy your next week off, and we'll see you in 2 weeks. And I will by then be moved back to California, so I'll be close to some of you by then.
Thank you, Mike.
Bye.
Yes, thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Everyone.
Thank you. Have a nice break.
Thank you.
Thank you. We'll see you in a couple weeks.
Bye.